comrades, thanks so much for the welcome. Can I just make one point, not by way of resolution, which is maybe the left we could do with a bit more diary coordination, because we've got a conference around the corner with the Labour Party on public ownership, alternative models of economy, alternative models of ownership, which is packed out, talking about how we can bring rail, water, energy back into public ownership, how we can double the cooperative sector, how we can look at alternative models of corporate governance as well, which has been incredibly successful. And actually, it's almost like the translation of the LRC's resolutions from 10 years ago into the Labour Party policy. So congratulations on all the campaigning. Apologies, as I say, from here on in we'll get better coordination of our diaries in the future. Let me just say this very, very briefly, and I can see I've come into the room just when there's an item which is the least contentious should be debated today. I'll just want to tell you where we're at, and I'll give you I've read the LRC statement, and I just want to give a couple of ideas about where I think the LRC should be going at the moment. In terms of, since the general election, we've now sought to consolidate the position within the party in terms of where we're going on our overall programme and our overall objectives. And that's meant we're doing an exercise at the moment to recognise that the manifesto that was in 2017 was a manifesto for that election. For that election. We have to take that manifesto and recognise, yes, it will be the foundations for the debate that we now have in the run-up to the next election, whenever that comes. And we have to use it as the basis for radicalising many of the ideas that were in that manifesto. And I pay tribute to Mike on the launch of the book this week that took a lot of those ideas from the manifesto, then looked at how they could be radicalised. The reason that we need to do that quickly is because the general election could come at any time. I think the Tories will cling on to office for as long as possible, but it will be clinging on to office, not clinging on to power, because I don't think they can exert power in the way in which they're divided in the cabinet, divided in the parliamentary party under the Tories, but also the fact that the DUP have a veto on any government policy that comes forward as well. But I think they will cling on, so we've got to be ready for both the short haul and the long haul for whenever that general election comes. So what we're doing at the moment is taking every policy commitment in that manifesto, turning it into an implementation manual about how that could be implemented, but then and also drafting legislation so it's on the shelf for whenever that election comes, but also going outwards now, much further outwards, and saying that was the commitment in that manifesto, that was the policy. How do we radicalise it, and how do we go further with it in terms of really testing it to how it can be implemented and how radical and how effective it can be? That's a huge and mammoth task when you think that manifesto was genuinely transformative. It crossed all policy areas, it crossed virtually every walk of life within our society itself. So it's a huge task, and that task can only be undertaken by the mass movement that we now have. So some of the work that we're now doing is again, trying to get the party to turn outwards again. That's why we're doing this conference today about alternative models of ownership. And again, it's a packed conference where people are coming along from different sectors and different parts of the party to actually talk about the detailed implementation. For example, about how we bring water back into public ownership. What should be the management structures? What is the role of the workers? What is the role of the consumers? How do we do it financially? What is the way in which we'll swap the bonds for shares and go forward on all that? What is the investment strategy? We're drilling down into that scale of detail, and that's important because this election literally could be at any time. And I keep saying it, to be frank, if our election campaign had another 2 weeks, we could be in government now, I think. I think we were that close in terms of building, well, pardon the expression, momentum into the campaign. That's where we're at. In terms of what's happening within the party, within the Parliamentary Labour Party, they're signed up to this exercise. They're signed up to this exercise. We're now involving virtually all the PLP in that discussion and debate and how we go forward. The front bench, the shadow cabinet, working extremely effectively, coherently working together. Parliamentary members of the parliamentary Labour Party, if they're not on the front bench and on the back benches, we're trying to make sure they're fully involved in those discussions. And yes, if there are criticisms, and if there is a critique developed, bringing them in to see how we can address those criticisms. We may not always agree, but at least we'll have an understanding about what those disagreements are and how we can best resolve them. So, in terms of mobilisation within Parliament, there's some issues where there'll be principled discussions and yes, principled disagreements, and you have to respect that. But again, I keep explaining to people, don't mistake democracy for dissent. That isn't what we're about now. But in terms of the mass movement of the party itself, again, in the discussions that are taking place, in all the conferences and the meetings all around the country that we're doing, we're still attracting large numbers. In fact, we're still recruiting more, and more people now are becoming much more involved in the discussions. And what's interesting, the wisdom of the crowds is building within our movement as well. People coming along with their own expertise to demonstrate how these individual policies can be more effectively implemented. So I'm confident, excited about the period we're going into. I just wish the election was sooner rather than later, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes forward in these coming months. With regard to the LRC, my view now, when we set it up at a time when basically we thought at that point in time we'd have to bring together rank and file members of the party, along with campaigning organisations spreading beyond the Labour Party and along with the trade unions. And it was done on Tony Benn's advice, basically, that we had to establish, and that's why we called it the LRC. It was like re-establishing the Labour Party within the Labour Party that at times we couldn't recognise ourselves as the Labour Party. And what happened was that the LRC built on that basis of bringing people together. I have to say, if you'd have asked me all those years ago, would Jeremy Corbyn be the leader of the Labour Party and me and Shadow Chancellor, of course I would have said yes. Because it's the old Gramsci, isn't it? Pessimism of the will. Optimism of the will, anyway. At that point in time, we thought it would be a much longer haul before we got into positions where we could mobilise a mass movement, build a mass movement, and then go into government. Well, we're here now. We're on the edge of that now. So I think, let me just throw this in, I think the LRC's role now is to do two things around maybe tactically deciding the individual issues, but the LRC should do two things around those issues that we decide are the priorities. One is, first of all, I think the LRC, we always wanted it to be a think tank. We always wanted it to be a place where people could develop ideas into policies for implementation based upon, again, the collective wisdom of our organisation and the expertise that we have. I think the LRC can still play that role. And as Mike has done in the publication of the book that he edited this week, that demonstrated the range of expertise that we can call upon to, as I say, take the policies that we have now, bring forward new ideas, and then radicalise what we've got. So I think there's a specific role for the LRC in doing that, particularly when we're faced with battering after battering at the moment of right-wing Tory-funded think tanks hitting us over policy. I was having a pleasant chat with Nick Robinson on the Today programme this morning, and he was quoting the Social Market Foundation. When they get us on, it's always left-wing that, and all this and all the rest of it. They don't bring the Social Market Foundation, they like to say, the most Thatcherite right-wing organisation that's ever been seen in the history of politics in this country. They don't introduce it in that way, we will. And they didn't say either that the report that they'd just done on the water industry, well actually Nick Robinson did at the 7:30 interview, was funded by the water companies themselves, so clearly was unbiased and lacking in any form of self-interest. But those think tanks are out there, well-funded, on the right, by commercial organisations in particular. We have limited resources in terms of funding, but we have massive resources in terms of intellectual weight. And I think the LRC has a role in looking at the areas it wants to concentrate on as a think tank to bring ideas forward. Secondly, those ideas will not get implemented without a Labour government, of course. But to get to a Labour government, we have to convince people about those ideas in practice. And that means running campaigns around those individual policy priorities to expose what's going on at the moment and then to proffer the alternative. I just take the water industry as an example. The water industry has been possibly one of the most gigantic rip-offs under the privatisation policy programme that Tories have brought forward. £18 billion paid out to shareholders over the last 10 years, 40% increase in prices and costs over and above inflation, and also, if you remember, when the water industry was privatised, all debts were wiped out. So when they were privatised, these companies took over debt-free. They've now racked up huge debts, and at the same time, paying out dividends, even in years when profits have not been made. So dividends have been higher than the actual profits made. Now, when you explain that to people, because this information doesn't get out there through the normal national media, the mainstream media, when you explain that to people, people are horrified at what's going on. They understand they're getting a poor service, high bills, and they're seeing rip-offs like this, and often those profits going into tax havens where no tax is paid as well. And people are getting angry about it. So there's now, in terms of water, in the opinion polls, 80% support for bringing it back into public ownership. But that support will dissipate unless we expose what's going on and then put forward our ideas in detail. Now, I think LRC can choose a few topics like that in which we work as a think tank to expose what's going on and put the alternative forward, but also we campaign to publicly get that information out. And I give the example of this. 20-odd years ago, I was involved in bringing together the tax justice campaign in Parliament, and we used to have meetings there. Some of you were there. They weren't, as well as I. There was half a dozen of us at best. Not many people interested, but we were with Prem Seeker and John Christensen and others doing the work, the research, bringing an analysis forward of what was going on, tax evasion, tax avoidance, how we could tackle it, what the policies were. We were getting no coverage whatsoever, and then a group of young people come along called UK Uncut. They run a direct action campaign to expose what's happening. They're turning up at the companies that are ripping us off as well to expose what's going on. A peaceful, direct action campaign in which they literally turned an issue that no one was talking about into, actually for a period of time, top of the agenda in lots of the media as well, because the media could not ignore what was a growing campaign. I think that's the style of campaigning for the future, which is about, first of all, acting as a think tank to develop the ideas, expose what's going on, put the alternative, and then mobilising then campaigns to develop support for those ideas and get the message across. I think that's the role of the LRC, and I think it's a unique role that the LRC can play, because we can pull in with other alliances, with trade unions and other campaigning groups to do it. If you look at an example of what's happened, Kat Hobbs was at our conference this morning. She was the one who we worked with through the trade unions on the fares campaign about rail. And again, what we saw there was passengers taking action in support of the campaign that they had down there to bring rail back into public ownership down in Bristol. I think that's the role that the LRC could play in the future. You'll all have different ideas, but that's my two pennyworth in this debate. We took a decision not to fold the LRC up into momentum because we thought there could be a distinct role for the LRC, particularly because it's an open and democratic organisation in which people can feel comfortable in participating. I think that was a right decision, but now we have to say what is the specific actions in this coming period that we need. And I'll be frank with you, from the leadership of the Labour Party perspective, what we need is the ideas and campaigning support to win people's hearts to those ideas in this coming period before we go into government. And then, of course, when we go into government, mobilisation to support that Labour government as it rolls out the policies. And I say time and time again at the various meetings I'm doing, the most important thing is to recognise that when we go into government next time, it cannot be, and we cannot tolerate it being, just a group of MPs, some hierarchical group going into Parliament, then going to number 10 and number 11, filling ministerial positions, cut off from the movement itself. When we go to government next time, we've all got to go into government.
Yes!
That means being integrally involved in the development of policy and then the implementation of that policy. I know, to be frank, on the range of policies that we're developing now as a result of the ideas that were developed initially within the LRC, there's so much work to be done on all those particular areas. The good thing about it is the enthusiasm is maintained, the levels of excitement within the movement are building rather than dissipating. The levels of support, and we've seen the opinion polls, we're on about 40%, something like that. The levels of support have been maintained since the general election, despite a media campaign that has been as hostile in the last few months as it was initially before the general election as well. Despite all that, we're maintaining the levels of support, we're winning local authority by-elections, and at the same time, we're working with particular groups to build the registration, particularly within the what is described as the precariat, to build the registration, to build political participation on a scale we've most probably not seen before. So I'm optimistic, but I'm also daunted by the scale of the challenge that we've got and the scale of the work that we've got to do. But I tell you, if you all turn up at Conway Hall for a special general meeting of the LRC on a wet, cold day like this, you build confidence in me about the commitment that we have within this movement. Solidarity.
We have a few minutes that we can take some questions.